To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence makes these stories worth sharing. We'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Derek Morrison had always been a man who understood consequences. At 34, he owned 3 successful auto repair shops across the county, built from nothing after his father abandoned the family when Derek was 16. His hands, permanently stained with motor oil despite countless washings, had pulled his mother and younger brother from poverty through sheer determination and 18-hour workdays. The double shift at the main shop had been brutal, a semi-truck breakdown that took 16 hours to fix, but the $12,000 repair bill would keep his employees fed for another month. Derek's philosophy was simple: take care of those who take care of you. Betray him, and face consequences that would make you wish you'd never been born. Amy Morrison had been the exception to his guarded nature. 5 years ago, she'd walked into his shop with a broken-down Honda and a smile that made him forget his usual wariness. She was a kindergarten teacher then, 26 years old with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see right through his defensive walls. Their courtship had been a whirlwind, 6 months of late-night conversations, weekend getaways, and for the first time in Derek's life, genuine vulnerability. Amy's sister Lisa was a different story entirely. 2 years younger than Amy, Lisa had never held a job for more than 6 months. She drifted from apartment to apartment, relationship to relationship, always landing on Amy and Derek's couch when her latest scheme fell apart. Derek had tolerated her because Amy insisted family was everything. He was about to learn just how wrong that philosophy could be. The Morrison house sat on 5 acres outside town, Derek's dream property that he'd bought as a wedding gift to Amy. The 2-story farmhouse had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd planned to build a family, maybe pass down to children who would carry on his name with pride. Tonight, walking up those familiar porch steps after the longest day of his life, Derek had no idea he was about to watch that dream burn to ashes. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, soft light spilling into the hallway. Derek pushed it open, expecting to find Amy curled up with a book as she often did when he worked late. Instead, Lisa sat on the edge of their king-sized bed, wearing a black dress that barely covered her thighs. Her blonde hair was styled differently than usual, and her makeup was heavier, more deliberate. She left with him, Lisa said without preamble, holding out a folded piece of paper. She told me to make sure you were comfortable and satisfied. Derek stared at the note, his mind struggling to process the words. The paper felt heavy in his hands, heavier than it should have been. Amy's handwriting, her familiar loops and curves, spelled out his destruction in careful blue ink. Derek, I know this will hurt, but I can't pretend anymore. Troy makes me feel alive in ways I forgot were possible. I need time to figure out what I really want. Lisa will explain everything. I'm sorry it has to be this way. Amy. Derek crumpled the paper slowly, his knuckles going white. When he looked up, Lisa was watching him with an expression he'd never seen before, calculating, predatory. And you're helping her? He asked, his voice deadly quiet. Lisa stood, moving closer until she was barely a foot away. I'm helping me. Amy's finally going after what she wants instead of settling for this. She gestured around the room dismissively. And I'm tired of being the third wheel in my own sister's perfect little life. Derek's mind raced. Amy had been distant lately, working late more often, claiming the school needed her for evening events. Phone calls she'd taken another room. Weekend trips to visit her college roommate that he'd been too busy to join. The signs had been there, but he'd trusted her completely. Who is Troy? Derek asked. Troy Brennan. You know him. He teaches at the high school. Amy met him at that education conference last month. Lisa's smile was sharp as broken glass. He's everything you're not, Derek. Sophisticated, educated, refined. Amy said she finally realized what she's been missing. Derek knew Troy Brennan by reputation. The high school English teacher was new to town, hired 6 months ago from some private school in California. Tall, lean, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to fight for anything in life. Derek had seen him at a few community events, always surrounded by admirers, always holding court with his stories of literary adventures and European travels. She wants to figure out what she really wants, Derek repeated slowly. Don't play dumb. She's in love with him. This marriage was a mistake, and everyone knows it except you. Lisa stepped even closer. But I've always thought you deserved better than someone who'd throw away everything you built together. Something in Lisa's tone made Derek look at her more carefully. The way she was dressed, the timing of her presence here, the carefully rehearsed speech. This wasn't spontaneous support. This was orchestrated. How long have you known, he asked. About Amy and Troy? Or about Amy planning to leave? Lisa's smile widened. I've known about the affair for 2 months. I've known about tonight for 2 weeks. And you said nothing. I was protecting my sister. But after tonight, after seeing how she just abandoned you like this, Lisa placed her hand on Derek's chest. I realized maybe I've been protecting the wrong person all along. Derek caught her wrist, his grip firm enough to make her wince. Lisa had always been the prettier sister, the one who turned heads everywhere she went. But Derek had never been interested in beautiful women who used their looks as weapons. He preferred substance over style, loyalty over lust. Now, looking into Lisa's eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't about comforting him or making up for her sister's betrayal. This was about winning. Lisa had always lived in Amy's shadow, and now she saw an opportunity to take something that belonged to her sister. Shall we begin? Lisa whispered, pressing closer. Derek released her wrist and stepped back. Get out. Derek, you don't understand. I can give you everything Amy never could. I can. I said get out. His voice carried the same tone he used with employees who stole from him or customers who tried to cheat him. Pack whatever Amy left here and take it with you. If I see you on my property again, you'll regret it. Lisa's facade cracked, revealing the ugly anger beneath. You're making a mistake. Amy isn't coming back to you, Derek. She's done with this life, done with you. And when you're ready to admit that, I'll still be here. No, Derek said quietly. You won't be. After Lisa left, Derek sat alone in his bedroom, surrounded by reminders of his life with Amy. Wedding photos on the dresser, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her books stacked on the nightstand. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixing with Lisa's cheaper fragrance to create something that made his stomach turn. Derek Morrison had never been a man who forgave betrayal. When his business partner tried to steal clients 3 years ago, Derek had destroyed him so completely that the man left town and never returned. When a customer accused him of fraud to avoid paying a legitimate bill, Derek had pursued legal action until the man filed bankruptcy. But this was different. This was personal. This was his wife, his marriage, his entire life built on what he now realized was a foundation of lies. 3 weeks. Amy wanted 3 weeks to decide between her marriage and her lover. Derek looked around the bedroom they'd shared for 4 years, at the life they'd built together, at everything he'd sacrificed to make her happy. 3 weeks would be more than enough time for Derek Morrison to remind everyone involved exactly why crossing him was a mistake they'd never have the chance to make again. Chapter 2. The Web Begins. Derek's brother Tyler arrived at sunrise, finding Derek exactly where he'd been for the past 6 hours, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and Amy's crumpled notes spread flat before him. Tyler was 2 years younger, but had inherited their father's lean build instead of Derek's broader frame. Unlike Derek, who'd never left their hometown, Tyler had spent 4 years in the Army before returning to work as Derek's general manager. Lisa called me at 5 in the morning, Tyler said, pouring himself coffee. Said I needed to check on you because Amy left with some teacher. Derek looked up from the note. Tyler was the only person in the world he trusted completely, the only one who knew about Derek's carefully hidden past, the 3 months he'd spent in juvenile detention at 17 for nearly killing a man who'd threatened their mother. Tyler also knew why Derek had really bought this house so far from town, why he'd chosen a property with perfect sight lines and only one access road. Lisa was here last night, Derek said. Made it clear this whole thing was planned. She knew about the affair for months. And she offered to console me. Tyler whistled low. Both sisters, huh? That's cold even for them. He sat across from Derek, studying his brother's face. What are you thinking? Derek had always been able to read people, a skill developed from years of dealing with customers who tried to scam him, employees who might steal, and competitors who'd do anything to undermine him. Amy's note wasn't just a confession. It was a calculated move designed to minimize her guilt while maximizing his pain. The 3-week timeline wasn't about making a decision. It was about giving her time to prepare for divorce proceedings while he sat here like a fool, waiting for her to come home. I'm thinking Amy Morrison just made the biggest mistake of her life, Derek said. Tyler leaned back in his chair. What do you need? Information. I want to know everything about Troy Brennan. Where he came from, why he left California, what skeletons he's hiding. And I want to know Amy's schedule, where they're going, who they're seeing. I can handle the research, Tyler said. What about Lisa? Lisa made her choice last night. She's part of this now. Derek stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the property he'd worked 60-hour weeks to buy. The morning sun caught the metal roof of his workshop behind the house, where he kept his real tools, not the ones for fixing cars, but the ones he'd collected over the years for other purposes. Most people who knew Derek Morrison thought he was just a successful businessman with a temper. They had no idea what he was really capable of when pushed too far. There's something else, Tyler said carefully. I did some checking last night after Lisa called. Troy Brennan isn't just some random teacher. His father owns Brennan Development, the company that's been trying to buy up property around the lake for that new resort project. Derek turned from the window. The same project Amy's been talking about for months? The one she said would bring jobs and tourism to the area? The same one. Brennan Development has made offers on half the properties in this county, including 3 that border yours. Amy's been to every town council meeting about it, even though it has nothing to do with the school district. The pieces began falling into place. Amy's sudden interest in local development, her newfound concern for economic growth, her frequent meetings with education consultants who were never named or identified. Derek had assumed she was becoming more civically minded. In reality, she'd been playing a much deeper game. How much do you think this property is worth if the resort gets approved? Derek asked. With lake access and 5 acres? Probably $2 million, maybe more. But Derek, there's no way. There's every way. Derek's voice was flat, emotionless. Amy's been planning this for months. The affair, the separation, probably the divorce. She gets half of everything in the settlement, including half the value of this land. With the resort project moving forward, she walks away with a fortune. Tyler was quiet for a long moment. You think Troy's father put him up to this? I think Amy Morrison is smarter than I gave her credit for. I think she saw an opportunity to trade up, from a mechanic's wife to a developer's daughter-in-law, and decided to take it. The affair is just the cover story. Derek pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Amy had insisted they get life insurance policies last year, supposedly because her friend at school had lost her husband unexpectedly. Another detail that made perfect sense now. There's something you should know, Derek said, still looking at his phone. Lisa didn't just offer to console me last night. She made it clear she'd been planning it for weeks. This whole thing, Amy leaving, Lisa being here to comfort me, it's coordinated. You think they're working together? I think Lisa has been in love with the idea of my life for years. The house, the business, the stability. She saw Amy's affair as her chance to step in and take over. Derek looked up at his brother. But there's a problem with their plan. What's that? They assume I'm going to sit here for 3 weeks, feeling sorry for myself, waiting for Amy to come back and tell me she chooses him. Derek's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. They have no idea who they're really dealing with. Tyler had seen that expression before, 16 years ago, when their father had shown up drunk and demanding money from their mother. Derek had been 18 then, already bigger and stronger than the man who'd abandoned them. Their father had left town that night with 3 broken ribs and a face that needed reconstructive surgery. He'd never come back. What's the plan? Tyler asked. First, we find out exactly what Amy and Troy are up to. Every detail, every conversation, every move they make for the next 3 weeks. Second, we figure out how the Brennan family really operates, because a development company that can buy up half a county has money, which means they have secrets. Derek walked to a cabinet above the refrigerator and pulled down a small metal box. Inside were documents he'd hoped never to use: birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses, all in different names. Souvenirs from a life he'd left behind when he'd met Amy. Third, Derek continued, we remind everyone involved that Derek Morrison isn't just some small-town mechanic they can scam and abandon. Some people are born to be victims. Others are born to make victims pay. Tyler looked at the false documents spread across the table. Derek, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I'm thinking my wife made a choice. She chose to betray me, humiliate me, and steal from me. She chose to involve her sister in a scheme to destroy my life and take everything I've built. Derek gathered the documents and put them back in the box. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice. And if she comes back? If she realizes she made a mistake? Derek walked back to the window, watching the sun climb higher over his property. Somewhere out there, Amy was probably waking up in Troy Brennan's bed, believing she'd successfully manipulated the husband she thought was too simple to see through her plan. Lisa was probably already calling her with updates about Derek's reaction, both sisters laughing about how easy it had been to fool him. She won't come back, Derek said quietly, because by the time I'm finished, there won't be anything left for her to come back to. Chapter 3. The Hunt Begins. Derek's first stop was the Riverside Diner, a place where information flowed more freely than coffee. Martha Holbrook had owned the diner for 25 years and knew every secret in town. More importantly, she owed Derek a favor. He'd fixed her delivery truck for free when she couldn't afford the repair bill. Derek Morrison, Martha said as he slid into a corner booth. Heard Amy took off with that fancy teacher. Sorry to hear it, honey. News travels fast, Derek said. Lisa was in here an hour ago, crying her eyes out about how torn up you were. Ordered 3 coffees to go. Martha poured Derek a cup without being asked. Funny thing, though, she was crying, but her makeup never smudged. Professional job, if you ask me. Derek had always liked Martha's sharp eye for detail. 3 coffees. 1 for her, 1 for Amy, 1 for the teacher. They're staying at the Lakeside Inn, room 237. Lisa made sure to mention it loud enough for half the diner to hear. The Lakeside Inn was the nicest hotel in town, expensive enough that most locals couldn't afford it. The fact that they were staying there instead of driving to the next county meant they wanted to be seen, wanted the whole town talking about Amy Morrison's dramatic departure. You know anything about this Troy Brennan? Derek asked. Martha's expression darkened. Know his type. Came in here about a month ago with Amy, real charming and smooth. Ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, then sent it back because it wasn't California quality. Tipped 5% and acted like he was doing me a favor. What about his family? Brennan Development? They've been sniffing around here for 2 years, buying up properties with promises of big money and new jobs. Half the folks who sold to them are still waiting for those jobs to materialize. Martha leaned closer. Word is they're having financial problems. The resort project is their last shot at staying solvent. Derek absorbed this information. A development company in financial trouble would be desperate to make the resort project work, which meant they'd be willing to bend rules, cut corners, maybe even break laws to secure the land they needed. From the diner, Derek drove to the county courthouse. As a business owner, he'd learned to navigate the bureaucracy of permits, licenses, and public records. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, recognized him immediately. Mr. Morrison, how can I help you today? I need to see all the public records on Brennan Development, incorporation documents, property transfers, building permits, anything on file. It took Patricia an hour to gather the files, but what Derek found was fascinating. Brennan Development had been incorporated in California 3 years ago, right around the time several major projects had failed due to environmental violations. They'd moved to this county 18 months ago and immediately began aggressive land acquisition, often paying well above market value for properties. The company was structured as a family trust, with Troy's father Richard Brennan as the primary trustee. But the financial documents showed something interesting. Most of their operating capital came from a series of loans secured against future development profits. If the resort project failed, the company would face immediate bankruptcy. Derek photographed every relevant document with his phone, then drove to the high school. As a local business owner who occasionally spoke to vocational classes, he had legitimate reasons to be there. He found Troy Brennan's classroom during the lunch hour. Troy was everything Derek had expected, tall, polished, with the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege. He was grading papers at his desk, occasionally glancing at his phone with a smile that made Derek's blood boil. Mr. Brennan? Derek Morrison. I own Morrison Auto. We've met at a few community events. Troy looked up, and Derek saw recognition flicker in his eyes, followed quickly by something that might have been guilt. Mr. Morrison. Yes, of course. How can I help you? I'm organizing a career day for the vocational students. Thought you might want to coordinate with us. Maybe bring some of your English students to learn about practical applications of technical writing. It was a reasonable request, the kind of community cooperation teachers were expected to support. But Troy's response was telling. That sounds interesting, but I'm pretty busy with the literature curriculum. Maybe next semester. Sure, Derek said. By the way, congratulations on your engagement. Troy went very still. My engagement? To my wife, Amy Morrison. I hear you two are planning quite a future together. The color drained from Troy's face. Mr. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Amy left me a note explaining everything. Very thoughtful of her, really. Saved us all a lot of awkward conversations. Derek studied Troy's reaction carefully. This wasn't a man confident in his choices or secure in his relationship. This was someone who'd been caught in a scheme he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Look, Troy said, standing up. I never meant for things to happen this way. Amy and we just connected and you decided to help yourself to my wife. I understand. These things happen. Troy's confusion was obvious. He'd expected anger, threats, maybe even violence. Derek's calm acceptance was throwing him off balance. I want you to know, Derek continued, I don't blame you entirely. Amy's a beautiful woman, and she can be very persuasive when she wants something. I'm sure she made it sound like our marriage was already over. She said you'd grown apart, Troy said carefully. That you weren't compatible anymore. Did she mention the resort project? How much money this property would be worth if your father's development gets approved? Troy's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. No? Interesting. Because according to the county records, Brennan Development has made offers on every property bordering mine. Substantial offers. The kind that would make a teacher's salary look like pocket change. Derek pulled out his phone and showed Troy one of the photos he'd taken at the courthouse, a property map with all the Brennan Development acquisitions highlighted. Derek's property was a glaring hole in the middle of their planned development. Mr. Morrison, Troy said, his voice shaking slightly. I swear to you, I had no idea about any connection between Amy and my father's business. Our relationship has nothing to do with the $2 million my property is worth if your father's resort gets built, with the fact that Amy would get half of that in a divorce settlement, with the convenient timing of your transfer to this school district, right when your family needed to secure the last pieces of land for their project. Derek watched Troy process this information, watched the realization dawn that he'd been used as thoroughly as Derek had. Amy Morrison hadn't just betrayed her husband. She'd manipulated her lover into a situation that could destroy both their lives. She played us both, Troy whispered. No, Derek said quietly. She played you. She tried to play me. There's a difference. Derek left Troy standing in his classroom, looking like a man who'd just realized he was standing in quicksand. The drive back to his house gave Derek time to think about what he'd learned. Amy's plan was more sophisticated than he'd initially thought, but it had a fatal flaw. It relied on everyone else playing their assigned roles without questioning the script. Tyler was waiting in the kitchen with a laptop full of research when Derek returned. I found some interesting things about the Brennan family, Tyler said. Richard Brennan has been married 3 times. Each time, the marriage ended right after a major business deal closed. The wives always got substantial settlements, but they also all signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. He has a pattern. Gets better. Troy isn't his biological son. Richard adopted him when he married Troy's mother, wife number 2. She died in a car accident 6 months after signing over custody rights. Very convenient timing. Derek sat down at the table. What about Amy's recent activities? She's been busy. Bank records show 3 large cash deposits in the past 2 months, each for exactly $9,999, just under the federal reporting requirement. The money came from a business account registered to something called Lakeside Consulting. Let me guess. Lakeside Consulting is connected to Brennan Development. Subsidiary company. Technically legitimate, but it's used for transactions they don't want directly tied to the parent company. Tyler pulled up another screen. But here's the really interesting part. Amy opened a safety deposit box last week. Paid for a full year in advance. Derek leaned back in his chair. Amy hadn't just been planning to leave him. She'd been building an escape route, probably with enough cash and documents to disappear entirely if her plan went wrong. The 3-week timeline wasn't about making a decision. It was about giving her time to finalize her exit strategy. There's one more thing, Tyler said. I found Amy and Lisa's rental car records. They're not staying at the Lakeside Inn tonight. They're driving to Chicago. Chicago. Richard Brennan has a condo there. High security building, private elevator, the works. If I had to guess, I'd say this is where Amy plans to spend her 3 weeks, safely out of reach while her lawyers prepare divorce papers that will give her everything she wants. Derek walked to the kitchen window again, looking out at his property. 5 acres that represented 15 years of backbreaking work, sacrificed relationships, and dreams deferred. Amy thought she could take half of it and walk away clean. She thought Derek would sit here for 3 weeks, waiting for her to return like a faithful dog. She was about to learn why Derek Morrison had never lost a fight that really mattered. Tyler, Derek said, how do you feel about taking a trip to Chicago? Chapter 4, The Gathering Storm. Derek's storage unit was located 20 miles outside town, rented under one of his alternate identities, and paid for in cash. Tyler had never asked why Derek maintained the unit, just as Derek had never explained why he'd spent years collecting certain items that most people would consider unusual for a small-town mechanic. The unit contained tools that weren't for fixing cars, surveillance equipment, lock-picking tools, electronics for intercepting communications. But more importantly, it contained detailed files on every person who'd ever crossed Derek in business, complete with photographs, financial records, and personal information that could destroy lives if used properly. Jesus, Derek, Tyler said, looking around the unit. How long have you been preparing for war? Since Dad left, Derek replied, pulling out a case of surveillance equipment. I learned early that people will take everything from you if they think you're weak. I decided never to be weak again. Derek had been building his information network for 16 years, ever since he'd realized that knowledge was more powerful than physical strength. Every employee who'd tried to steal from him, every customer who'd attempted fraud, every competitor who'd spread lies about his business, Derek had files on all of them. Most had learned their lessons and moved on. A few had required more permanent solutions. What's the plan? Tyler asked. Amy thinks she's safe in Chicago, probably already celebrating her victory. She has no idea we know about the safety deposit box or the cash payments. Derek loaded equipment into a duffel bag. While she's playing house with Troy, we're going to find out exactly what the Brennan family is really hiding. They drove to Chicago in Derek's personal vehicle, a nondescript sedan with tinted windows and modifications that weren't immediately obvious. Derek had learned long ago that the key to effective surveillance was being invisible, blending into the background until your targets forgot you existed. The Brennan condo was in a prestigious building overlooking Lake Michigan. Derek parked across the street with a clear view of the entrance while Tyler set up surveillance equipment in the back seat. Within an hour, they had confirmation that Amy, Lisa, and Troy were all inside. How do you want to handle this? Tyler asked. We wait. Sooner or later, one of them will make a mistake. Derek's patience was legendary among people who knew him well. He could wait days for the right moment, weeks if necessary. While other people acted on emotion, Derek acted on opportunity. An opportunity always came to those who were prepared for it. Their first break came at sunset. Lisa emerged from the building alone, dressed for an evening out. She hailed a taxi and disappeared into the Chicago nightlife. Derek memorized the taxi's license plate number and made a mental note to track its destination later. The second break came an hour later when Troy's phone rang. Derek's electronic surveillance equipment had been intercepting all communications from the building's vicinity, and Troy's conversation was crystal clear. Dad, we have a problem, Troy said. Derek Morrison knows about the property connection. He came to my classroom and laid out the whole thing, the land acquisitions, the timing, everything. Richard Brennan's voice was calm but edged with steel. How much does he know? Enough to cause problems. He knows about Amy's payments from Lakeside Consulting. He knows the property is worth millions if the resort goes through. And what did you tell him? Nothing. I acted surprised, like I had no idea there was a connection. But Dad, he's not stupid. And Amy never told me any of this was planned. I thought our relationship was real. Derek heard Richard Brennan's laugh, cold and calculating. Son, nothing about this family is real. Your mother learned that the hard way. Amy Morrison is learning it now. The question is whether you're smart enough to learn it without paying the same price. What do you mean? I mean Amy Morrison has served her purpose. She's gathered all the intelligence we need on her husband's property, his business, his financial situation. We know exactly how to handle him in court when the divorce proceedings begin. We don't need her anymore. Derek exchanged glances with Tyler. Amy thought she was the predator, but she'd been prey all along. Dad, you can't just. I can do whatever is necessary to protect this family's interests. Amy Morrison signed a contract when she took our money. She agreed to deliver her husband's property as part of the divorce settlement. If she thinks she can double-cross us and keep the money without delivering, she's about to learn how the Brennan family handles breach of contract. The conversation ended, and Derek processed what he'd heard. Amy hadn't just been planning to steal his property. She'd been contracted to do it by the Brennan family. The affair with Troy wasn't a passionate romance. It was a business transaction designed to position Amy for a divorce that would give Brennan Development access to Derek's land. We need to get inside that building, Derek said. How? Security's tight, and we don't have the right equipment. Derek smiled grimly. We don't need to break in. We're going to be invited. Derek pulled out one of his phones, a burner device loaded with untraceable calling software, and dialed the building's front desk. Good evening. This is Detective Mike Sullivan with Chicago PD, Derek said, affecting a slight Chicago accent. We have a situation involving one of your residents, Richard Brennan. There's been a domestic disturbance call from a neighbor, and we need to respond immediately. The desk clerk was appropriately concerned. Of course, Detective. Mr. Brennan is in the penthouse. Should I call up and let him know you're coming? No, please don't. In domestic situations, advance warning can escalate the danger. We need to respond quietly and quickly. Understood. I'll have security meet you at the elevator. Derek and Tyler entered the building 5 minutes later, dressed in dark suits with fake badges visible on their belts. The security guard was young and nervous, exactly the type who wouldn't question authority figures who seemed to know what they were doing. Any history of problems with this resident? Derek asked as they rode the elevator to the penthouse floor. Not Mr. Brennan himself, the guard said. But there was some kind of disturbance yesterday when his son brought 2 women up. Lots of raised voices, doors slamming. One of the women left crying. Derek filed that information away. Trouble in paradise already. The penthouse hallway was empty, but Derek could hear voices from behind the heavy wooden door of the Brennan unit. Richard Brennan was speaking, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. You signed an agreement, Amy. You took our money. You agreed to deliver your husband's property as part of the divorce settlement. Now you're having second thoughts. Amy's voice was defensive, smaller than Derek had ever heard it. I just think we moved too fast. Derek's not as simple as I thought. He's asking questions, connecting dots. Maybe we should wait, let things cool down. There is no waiting. The resort project needs to break ground in 6 months, or we lose our financing. Your husband's property is the centerpiece of the development. We need clean title to that land, which means we need him financially destroyed and eager to sell. But what if he fights the divorce? What if he demands a full financial investigation? Richard Brennan's laugh was ugly. Derek Morrison is a small-town mechanic with a high school education. Our lawyers will eat him alive. Besides, by the time we're finished, he'll be facing criminal charges for tax evasion, business fraud, and a few other surprises we've prepared. Derek's jaw tightened. They weren't just planning to steal his property. They were planning to destroy his reputation and send him to prison. The IRS will be very interested in those cash payments you claim never happened, Richard continued. Amazing how easy it is to create evidence of tax fraud when you have the right contacts. Tyler touched Derek's arm, a silent warning. They had enough information now. Time to leave before someone realized they weren't really police officers. But as they turned to go, Derek heard Amy's voice change, taking on a tone he recognized, the same manipulative sweetness she'd used on him for years. What about Troy? He's starting to ask questions about our relationship, about whether any of this was real. Troy will do what he's told, just like he always has. And if he doesn't, Richard's voice trailed off meaningfully. Derek had heard enough. Amy Morrison had betrayed him for money and thought she could walk away clean. Richard Brennan had orchestrated the entire scheme and planned to frame Derek for crimes he'd never committed. Troy was a pawn being manipulated by people who would destroy him the moment he stopped being useful. They were all about to learn that Derek Morrison was nobody's victim. Back in the car, Tyler was shaking his head. Derek, this is bigger than we thought. These people have connections, lawyers, money. They're planning to frame you for federal crimes. I know. We should go to the FBI. This is conspiracy, fraud, maybe RICO violations. No. Derek said quietly. The FBI would take months to build a case, if they even believed us. By then, Amy would have her divorce, the Brennans would have my property, and I'd be fighting criminal charges with my life savings drained by legal fees. So what's the alternative? Derek started the car and pulled away from the building. In his rearview mirror, he could see the lights of the penthouse where his wife was celebrating her betrayal with the people who planned to destroy him. The alternative is that Amy Morrison and the Brennan family are about to discover what happens when you try to destroy Derek Morrison. They think they're playing chess with a simple man who doesn't understand their sophisticated schemes. Derek's smile in the rearview mirror was cold enough to freeze blood. They're about to learn they're actually playing with someone who's been planning for this moment his entire life. Chapter 5. The Trap Titans. Derek's next move came at dawn. While Amy, Lisa, and Troy slept peacefully in Richard Brennan's penthouse, Derek was 3 blocks away, sitting in the lobby of the building that housed Brennan Development's Chicago offices. He'd changed his appearance, different clothes, glasses, a baseball cap pulled low, and carried a clipboard that made him look like any other service technician. The night security guard was due to be replaced at 6 a.m., and Derek had timed his arrival perfectly. The incoming day shift would be fresh and alert, but they'd also be unfamiliar with anyone who might have legitimate early morning business in the building. Derek's locksmith uniform and confident demeanor got him past the lobby without a second glance. The Brennan Development offices occupied the entire 15th floor. Derek's lock-picking skills, honed during his teenage years, made quick work of the reception area door. Once inside, he had 15 minutes before the first employees arrived, but Derek only needed 10. Richard Brennan's office was exactly what Derek had expected. Expensive furniture, family photos, and a massive safe behind a painting that probably cost more than most people's cars. But Derek wasn't interested in the safe. He was interested in Brennan's computer. The password security was laughably weak, Brennan 1, followed by the current year. Derek inserted a USB drive that Tyler had prepared, a piece of military-grade surveillance software that would copy every file and email on the system while installing a permanent backdoor for future access. While the program ran, Derek photographed everything in the office that might be useful. Financial documents left on the desk showed that Brennan Development was in worse shape than their public filings indicated. They had less than 3 months of operating capital remaining, and their loans were structured in a way that would trigger immediate foreclosure if the resort project failed. But the most interesting discovery was a folder labeled Morrison Project that contained detailed surveillance photos of Derek's property, financial records that could only have come from Amy, and a timeline that made Derek's blood run cold. According to the documents, the plan had been in motion for 8 months, not 3. Amy's sudden interest in local politics, her night classes that Derek had thought were for professional development, her weekend trips to visit college friends. All of it had been preparation for this moment. She'd been building a case for divorce while gathering intelligence on Derek's assets and vulnerabilities. The timeline showed that Amy was supposed to have filed for divorce 3 days ago, while Derek was still reeling from her departure. The delay meant something had gone wrong with their plan, probably Troy's unexpected attack of conscience. Derek's phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, police scanner chatter. Domestic disturbance call at the Brennan building. Real cops this time. Derek finished copying the files and left the office exactly as he'd found it. The elevator delivered him to the lobby just as real Chicago police officers were entering the building, responding to a report of suspicious men impersonating police officers the night before. Derek walked past them without a glance, just another service worker starting his day. By the time the police reached the 15th floor, Derek was 6 blocks away, already reviewing the files he'd copied on Tyler's laptop. "This is incredible," Tyler said, scrolling through the documents. "They have detailed psychological profiles of you, complete financial records, even medical information. How did Amy get access to your private medical files?" Derek thought about Amy's friend who worked at the hospital billing department, the woman Amy often met for lunch and who always seemed unusually interested in Derek's health insurance claims. "She's been planning this for almost a year," Derek said. "Every conversation, every intimate moment, every time I trusted her with something personal, she was gathering intelligence." The betrayal cut deeper than Derek had expected. He'd thought Amy had simply fallen for another man and made an impulsive decision. The reality was far worse. She'd been systematically preparing to destroy him while pretending to love him, playing the role of devoted wife while building a case for taking everything he'd worked for. "What's our next move?" Tyler asked. Derek looked at the surveillance photos of his property, taken from angles that could only have been shot by someone with unlimited access to his home. Amy hadn't just betrayed his trust. She'd violated his sanctuary, the one place where he'd felt safe from the world. "We're going to turn their own plan against them," Derek said. "They want to frame me for tax evasion and business fraud. We're going to give them exactly what they want." Derek's business attorney, Jim Hendricks, had been handling Derek's legal affairs for 10 years. He was the kind of small-town lawyer who prided himself on personal relationships and ethical practice, exactly the wrong kind of attorney for the war Derek was about to wage. But Derek didn't need Jim's legal expertise. He needed his access to financial records and his unquestioned trust in Derek's integrity. "Jim, I need you to file some paperwork for me," Derek said, sitting across from the lawyer's cluttered desk. "I want to transfer ownership of my business assets to Tyler, effective immediately." "Derek, that's a significant move. Are you sure you want to?" "I'm sure. I also want to liquidate my personal accounts and convert everything to cash. And I want you to begin preliminary discussions with the IRS about a voluntary disclosure regarding some potential tax issues." Jim's expression changed from confusion to alarm. "Derek, if you think there are problems with your tax filings, we should handle this very carefully. Voluntary disclosure can protect you from criminal prosecution, but it also means admitting guilt." "I understand, but I'd rather deal with this proactively than wait for the government to come knocking." Derek was counting on Jim's reaction being exactly what it was: immediate concern followed by protective legal action. By evening, Jim would have filed the necessary paperwork to protect Derek's assets and begun the process of voluntary tax disclosure. On paper, it would look like Derek was desperately trying to hide assets and avoid criminal charges. In reality, Derek was building a false trail for the Brennan family to follow. When they inevitably accessed his financial records, probably through Amy's continued access to his personal information, they would see exactly what they expected to see: a panicked man trying to hide his crimes. Derek's next stop was the local FBI field office, where he requested a meeting with Agent Patricia Vasquez, the white-collar crime specialist who'd investigated several local business fraud cases. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Vasquez said as Derek was escorted into her office. "What can I do for you?" "I think my wife is involved in a conspiracy to steal my property," Derek said. "I have evidence that she's been paid by a development company to gather information about my assets and manipulate me into a divorce that would give them access to my land." Derek spread the documents he'd copied from Richard Brennan's office across Agent Vasquez's desk, carefully omitting any that would reveal how he'd obtained them. He presented them as materials Amy had left behind in her hurry to leave. Agent Vasquez studied the documents with growing interest. "This is very sophisticated, Mr. Morrison. If these documents are genuine, you're talking about a complex fraud scheme involving interstate commerce, conspiracy, and possibly money laundering." "That's what I thought. But I'm worried they're going to try to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. My attorney says they might claim I've been evading taxes or committing business fraud." "Have you been evading taxes or committing business fraud?" "No, but I've been sloppy with record keeping. And if someone wanted to make it look like I was hiding income or assets, they probably could." Agent Vasquez made notes on a legal pad. "Mr. Morrison, I need to be honest with you. Based on what you've shown me, you should probably have a criminal defense attorney present for this conversation." "Why?" "I haven't committed any crimes." "Because conspiracy and fraud cases are complex, and innocent people sometimes get caught up in them. If the Brennan family is as sophisticated as these documents suggest, they might try to frame you as a co-conspirator rather than a victim." Derek had been counting on exactly this reaction. Agent Vasquez was now officially aware of the case, which meant any future investigation would have to account for Derek's cooperation. If the Brennan family tried to frame him later, they'd have to explain why their victim had voluntarily brought the case to federal attention. "What should I do?" Derek asked. "Get a good lawyer. Document everything. And be very careful about any contact with your wife or the Brennan family. If they're running a sophisticated con, they might try to manipulate you into doing something that would implicate you in their crimes." Derek left the FBI office with exactly what he'd wanted: official documentation that he was a cooperating victim, not a criminal suspect. Agent Vasquez would begin a preliminary investigation, and the Brennan family would eventually learn that their target had federal protection. By the time Derek returned home, Tyler had news that changed everything. "Lisa's back," Tyler said. "She's been calling your phone for 2 hours, says it's urgent. Something about Amy being in trouble and needing your help." Derek looked at his phone. 14 missed calls from Lisa, each message more desperate than the last. The final message was barely coherent. "Derek, please call me back. Something's wrong with Amy. I think she's in real danger. The Brennan family isn't what we thought. Please, I need to see you tonight." Derek smiled grimly. The Brennan family was beginning to clean house, and Lisa had just realized she was as expendable as everyone else in their scheme. Now she wanted Derek's protection from the people she'd helped betray him to. "Call her back," Derek told Tyler. "Tell her I'll meet her at the house tonight. Tell her I want answers about everything. The affair, the money, the plan to steal my property. Tell her if she's honest with me, maybe we can figure out how to keep her safe." Tyler looked uncomfortable. "Derek, you're not actually going to trust her, are you?" "No," Derek said, "but I'm going to let her think I am. Because Lisa Montgomery is about to become the key to destroying everyone who betrayed me." Derek Morrison had been patient long enough. The trap was set, the pieces were in motion, and his enemies had just made their first critical mistake. They'd assumed that Derek would be too hurt and confused to fight back effectively. They were about to learn that Derek Morrison's greatest strength had never been his ability to build things. It was his ability to tear them down. Chapter 6: The Revelation. Lisa arrived at Derek's house after midnight, driving a rental car with Illinois plates and looking like someone who hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her blonde hair was disheveled, and her hands shook as she lit cigarette after cigarette on Derek's front porch. "Thank you for seeing me," she said as Derek let her into the house. "I know you have every reason to hate me." "I don't hate you, Lisa," Derek said, his voice carefully neutral. "But I am curious about why you're here instead of celebrating in Chicago with Amy and her new boyfriend." Lisa collapsed into one of Derek's kitchen chairs, her facade of control finally cracking. "Because Amy and Troy might be dead." Derek poured 2 cups of coffee, using the time to study Lisa's body language. She was genuinely terrified, but Derek had learned long ago that Lisa Montgomery was capable of lying convincingly even when she was afraid. "Tell me what happened," Derek said. "We went to Chicago like we planned. Amy was so excited, talking about how we'd finally gotten away from this town, how she was going to be rich enough to do whatever she wanted." Lisa's voice broke slightly. "But when we got to Richard Brennan's condo, everything changed." Derek sat across from her, waiting. One of the most effective interrogation techniques was simply remaining silent until the other person felt compelled to fill the void. "Richard wasn't what Amy expected," Lisa continued. "She thought he'd be grateful, maybe even romantic about the whole thing. Instead, he treated her like an employee who'd completed an assignment. He had a contract ready for her to sign, spelling out exactly how much money she'd get when the divorce was finalized and how she'd transfer her share of your property to his company. And Amy signed it. She tried to negotiate, said she wanted more money, better terms, maybe a permanent relationship with Troy instead of just a one-time payment." Lisa lit another cigarette with shaking hands. "Richard laughed at her, told her she was a small-town schoolteacher who'd been useful for gathering information, but now she was just another liability to be managed." Derek absorbed this information. Amy had thought she was playing the Brennan family, but they'd been playing her from the beginning. The affair with Troy, the elaborate deception, even Lisa's involvement, all of it had been orchestrated by Richard Brennan to get access to Derek's property. What happened to Troy? He tried to defend Amy, started talking about how they really did care about each other, how this wasn't supposed to be just business. Lisa's laugh was bitter. Richard told him that caring was a luxury the Brennan family couldn't afford. Then he made a phone call, and 2 men came to the condo. What kind of men? The kind who make people disappear. Richard told Amy and Troy they could either sign new contracts, ones that gave Richard everything he wanted with no questions asked, or they could take a permanent vacation to the bottom of Lake Michigan. Derek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late hour. He'd suspected the Brennan family was ruthless, but he hadn't anticipated they were willing to commit murder to protect their interests. Amy signed the contract, Lisa continued. But Troy refused. Said he was going to the police, going to expose the whole scheme. The last thing I heard before I ran was Richard telling his men to handle the Troy problem permanently. And you just left them there? Lisa's eyes flashed with anger. What was I supposed to do? Fight off 2 professional killers? I barely made it out of the building alive. I've been driving for 12 hours straight, afraid to stop, afraid they might be following me. Derek stood and walked to the kitchen window, ostensibly to check the driveway, but actually to think through what Lisa had told him. If Troy was really dead, it changed the entire situation. Amy might be next, and Lisa herself was clearly in danger. But Derek had learned long ago that Lisa Montgomery's stories often contained just enough truth to make the lies believable. Why come to me, he asked. You helped Amy betray me. You offered to sleep with me while my wife was running away with another man. Why would you think I'd help you now? Because you're the only person who can stop Richard Brennan, Lisa said. Amy told me about your past, about the things you did before you met her. She said you were dangerous when people crossed you, that there were things about Derek Morrison that most people never saw. Derek turned from the window. What exactly did Amy tell you about my past? She said you nearly killed a man when you were 17. Said you had connections to people who could make problems disappear. She said that's why she was always careful never to really anger you, because she knew what you were capable of when someone truly betrayed you. This was interesting. Amy had known about Derek's juvenile record, but she'd never mentioned knowing about his more recent activities. The connections Lisa mentioned could only refer to Derek's network of contacts from his business dealings, people who operated in gray areas and asked fewer questions than most. And now you want me to use those connections to save Amy? I want you to use them to save all of us, Lisa said. Richard Brennan thinks he can destroy anyone who threatens his plans. He thinks he's untouchable because he has money and lawyers and political connections. But he's never gone up against someone like you. Derek sat back down, studying Lisa's face in the dim kitchen light. Her terror seemed genuine, but her story had convenient gaps. Why had Richard let her escape? Why kill Troy but keep Amy alive? Why had she driven straight back to the one person who had the most reason to want revenge against her? Lisa, Derek said quietly, I need you to tell me the truth about something. Did you really help Amy because you loved her, or did you help her because Richard Brennan paid you to? Lisa's face went white. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Amy's plan required her to have someone she trusted helping her, someone who could provide emotional support and practical assistance, someone who could manipulate me after she left, maybe convince me to do something stupid that would help their case in divorce court. Derek pulled out his phone and showed Lisa a photo he'd taken in Richard Brennan's office, a financial document showing payments to Lisa Montgomery, consultant, dating back 6 months. You've been on Brennan's payroll since the beginning, Derek continued. Your job was to seduce me after Amy left, get me emotionally compromised, maybe trick me into doing something that would give them leverage in court. The crying sister act, the offers of comfort, all of it was scripted. Lisa stared at the photo for a long moment, then slowly looked up at Derek. When she spoke, her voice was completely different, colder, more calculating. You're smarter than they gave you credit for, she said. I'm smarter than you gave me credit for. The question now is whether you're smart enough to realize that your employers just sacrificed you to save themselves. Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Think about it, Lisa. Richard Brennan is cleaning house, getting rid of everyone who knows too much about his plans. Amy's probably already dead. Troy's definitely dead. And you're a loose end who can connect him to a conspiracy that involves fraud, extortion, and murder. Lisa's composure cracked again. He promised me $50,000 when the divorce was finalized. He said all I had to do was keep you distracted and emotional, maybe get you to do something reckless that would help their lawyers. And instead, you drove straight back here to warn me. Why? Because I realized I'm next on his list. The only reason I'm still alive is because he thinks I'm still useful. But as soon as you're out of the picture, I'm just another witness who knows too much. Derek nodded slowly. Lisa had finally told him something that sounded completely true. So what do you want from me? He asked. Protection. Help. I don't know, something. You're the only person I know who might be able to go up against Richard Brennan and win. Derek stood and walked to the window again, this time genuinely checking the driveway. Lisa's rental car was the only vehicle visible, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Richard Brennan would want to know where Lisa had gone and what she might be planning. Lisa, Derek said, I'm going to make you an offer. You can help me destroy Richard Brennan and save whatever's left of Amy, or you can take your chances with his cleanup crew. But if you choose to help me, you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, with no questions and no second guessing. What do you want me to do? Derek turned from the window and smiled. The same cold expression Tyler had seen 16 years ago when their father came home demanding money. I want you to call Richard Brennan and tell him that Derek Morrison is ready to make a deal. Chapter 7. The Return. 3 weeks to the day after Amy had left her crumpled note on Derek's bed, she returned home. But she didn't come back alone, and she didn't come back quietly. Derek was in his workshop behind the house when he heard the convoy of vehicles coming up his driveway. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows and Illinois plates. He'd been expecting this moment for days, ever since Lisa had made her phone call to Richard Brennan and set the final phase of Derek's plan in motion. Amy emerged from the lead vehicle looking nothing like the confident woman who'd orchestrated her own disappearance. She was pale, disheveled, and her hands were shaking as she approached the house. Behind her, Richard Brennan stepped out of the second SUV, flanked by 2 men who were obviously professional security. But it was the third vehicle that drew Derek's attention. Lisa climbed out of the passenger seat, followed by a man Derek didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase that probably contained legal documents designed to finalize Derek's destruction. Derek walked slowly from his workshop to the house, taking his time, letting them all see that he wasn't surprised or intimidated by their theatrical arrival. Tyler emerged from the house and took a position near the front door, his military bearing making it clear that Derek wasn't alone. Amy, Derek said as she reached the porch steps. Welcome home. Amy's composure cracked the moment she heard his voice. Derek, I'm so sorry. I never wanted things to go this far. I thought I could control it, but Richard. Shut up, Amy, Richard Brennan interrupted, stepping forward. Mr. Morrison, my name is Richard Brennan. I believe you know why we're here. Derek studied the man who'd orchestrated the destruction of his marriage. Richard Brennan was exactly what Derek had expected. Expensively dressed, supremely confident, radiating the kind of arrogance that came from a lifetime of getting whatever he wanted through money and intimidation. I know you're trespassing on my property, Derek said. Beyond that, you'll have to enlighten me. We're here to finalize the divorce settlement that your wife agreed to. She's prepared to sign papers that will give you a clean separation and her a fair share of the marital assets. Richard gestured to the man with the briefcase. My attorney has prepared all the necessary documents. Derek looked at Amy, who was staring at the ground like a child caught in an elaborate lie. Amy, is that what you want? A clean separation and a fair share. When Amy looked up, Derek could see terror in her eyes. Derek, there are things you don't understand. If I don't sign these papers, if I don't go through with this, if you don't go through with this, you'll face the same consequences as your boyfriend Troy, Richard said quietly. Derek felt Tyler tense beside him, but Derek's expression never changed. What happened to Troy, Richard? Troy had an accident. Very tragic. But accidents happen to people who make poor decisions about their loyalties. Derek nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. I see. And what poor decision did Troy make? He decided to go to the FBI with wild stories about conspiracy and fraud. Unfortunately, before he could make his statement, he had a fatal car accident on Lakeshore Drive. Very dangerous road, especially late at night. I'm sure it is. And Amy understands that similar accidents could happen to other people who make poor decisions. Amy understands perfectly. Don't you, Amy? Amy nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. Derek, please just sign the papers. Take whatever settlement they're offering. Don't try to fight this. Derek looked around at the assembled group. Richard Brennan with his confident smirk, his attorney with his briefcase full of legal documents, his security team with their obvious weapons, Lisa standing slightly apart from the others, and Amy begging him to surrender everything he'd worked for. There's just one problem, Derek said. What's that? Richard asked. I already gave my property away. Derek pulled out a folded document from his back pocket and handed it to Richard's attorney. 3 days ago, I transferred ownership of this property, my business, and all my assets to my brother Tyler. Legally speaking, I don't own anything for Amy to claim in a divorce settlement. The attorney studied the document, his face growing pale. This is a legitimate transfer. Recorded with the county, notarized, completely legal. Richard's confidence faltered for the first time. That's impossible. You couldn't have known. Couldn't have known what? That my wife was planning to steal my property? That she'd been working with you for months to set up this elaborate con? That you killed Troy when he got inconvenient? Derek's smile was thin as razor wire. Richard, I've known about your little scheme since the second week. The question is, what are you going to do about it now? Richard's security team shifted nervously, hands moving closer to their weapons. But Derek's attention was focused on Lisa, who was backing slowly toward the tree line at the edge of his property. The problem with complex plans, Derek continued, is that they require everyone to play their assigned roles. But people are unpredictable. Take Lisa, for example. Richard spun around to look at Lisa, who had now reached the edge of the woods. Lisa? What is he talking about? Lisa's been recording our conversations for the past week, Derek said. Amazing what people will agree to when they think they're about to be murdered by their business partners. She's documented everything. The conspiracy to steal my property, the frame-up attempt, even your confession to murdering Troy. Lisa pulled a small recording device from her pocket and held it up. Everything, Richard, including your charming description of how you dealt with your previous wives. Richard's face went white. You stupid bitch. You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, Lisa said. I've saved my own life by making sure you can never afford to kill me. Those recordings are already in the hands of the FBI. Derek was watching Richard's security team, noting how their hands had moved to their weapons. I wouldn't, gentlemen. You're currently surrounded by federal agents who've been watching this property for 3 days. As if summoned by his words, FBI agents in tactical gear emerged from concealment positions around the house. Agent Patricia Vasquez stepped out of Derek's workshop, weapon drawn but not aimed. Richard Brennan, she called out. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and accessory to murder. You have the right to remain silent. Richard's attorney dropped his briefcase and raised his hands. The security team realized they were outgunned and outnumbered, slowly reaching for the sky. But Richard himself stood frozen, staring at Derek with naked hatred. This is impossible, Richard said. You're a small-town mechanic. You don't have the connections or the intelligence to orchestrate something like this. Derek walked closer to Richard, close enough that only he could hear Derek's next words. I'm a small-town mechanic who spent 16 years preparing for the day someone would try to take everything from me. You assumed I was stupid because I work with my hands. You assumed I was weak because I forgave my wife's sister when she tried to seduce me. You assumed I was isolated because I chose to live in a small town. Derek's voice dropped to a whisper. You assumed wrong about everything, Richard. And now you're going to spend the rest of your life paying for those assumptions. As the FBI agents moved in to make arrests, Derek turned to Amy, who was sobbing uncontrollably on his front porch. Derek, she said, I never wanted Troy to die. I never wanted any of this to go so far. I just thought. You thought you could betray me and walk away rich, Derek said. You thought I was too simple to understand what you were really doing. You thought you could take everything I'd built and start a new life with someone else's money. Derek knelt down so he was at eye level with his wife of 4 years. Amy, I want you to understand something very clearly. This marriage is over. You will get nothing in the divorce. No money, no property, no alimony. You'll be lucky if you avoid criminal charges as an accessory to Troy's murder. Derek, please. But more than that, Derek continued, I want you to understand that Derek Morrison is not the man you thought you married. The man you thought you married was weak enough to be manipulated, simple enough to be deceived, and forgiving enough to take you back after you betrayed him. Derek stood and looked down at the woman who'd shared his bed while planning his destruction. That man never existed, Amy. And now you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that the real Derek Morrison was always watching, always planning, always 3 steps ahead of everyone who thought they could take advantage of him. Amy was led away in handcuffs, still sobbing, still begging for forgiveness that would never come. Lisa was placed in protective custody, her cooperation having earned her immunity in exchange for her testimony. Richard Brennan and his associates were loaded into federal vehicles, their elaborate scheme having collapsed into the nightmare of a federal prosecution that would destroy them as completely as they'd planned to destroy Derek. As the convoy of law enforcement vehicles disappeared down his driveway, Derek stood alone on his front porch with Tyler. The house was quiet again, the way it had been before Amy filled it with lies and betrayal. What now? Tyler asked. Derek looked out over his property, 5 acres that had nearly been stolen from him, a home that had been violated by people he'd trusted, a life that had been systematically dismantled by those closest to him. Now we rebuild, Derek said. But this time, we build it for people who understand loyalty. People who know that Derek Morrison takes care of those who take care of him, and destroys anyone who tries to take what's his. Derek Morrison had been tested by betrayal and had emerged stronger. The people who'd tried to destroy him were now facing federal prison sentences, their own lives destroyed by the same ruthless planning they'd tried to use against him. In the end, Derek thought, justice wasn't about forgiveness or second chances. It was about consequences. And now everyone who'd betrayed him was going to live with the consequences of their choices for the rest of their lives. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. 6 months after the arrests, Derek sat in a federal courthouse watching Richard Brennan's sentencing hearing. The man who'd once radiated confidence and power now looked broken, his expensive suit unable to hide the fact that he'd lost everything: his company, his freedom, and his family's legacy. The prosecution had built an airtight case using Lisa's recordings, the documents Derek had photographed in Richard's office, and financial records that showed the full scope of the Brennan family's criminal enterprise. What had started as a scheme to steal Derek's property had revealed a pattern of fraud, extortion, and violence spanning multiple states and dozens of victims. Troy Brennan's death had been reclassified as murder after investigators found evidence that his car had been tampered with. Richard's security team had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, providing detailed testimony about other accidents they'd arranged for people who'd threatened the Brennan family's interests. Judge Margaret Crawford looked down at Richard from her bench with the expression of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with criminals who thought money made them untouchable. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "your crimes represent a level of premeditation and callousness that frankly shocks this court. You orchestrated the systematic destruction of multiple families, committed fraud on a massive scale, and ultimately ordered the murder of your own adopted son when he threatened to expose your crimes." Richard's attorney had argued for leniency, claiming his client was a first-time offender who'd made poor decisions under financial pressure. The judge was not impressed. "The court sentences you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your assets will be forfeited to compensate your victims, and you will never again have the opportunity to destroy innocent lives for your own profit." Derek felt no satisfaction watching Richard led away in shackles. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that dangerous people could never hurt anyone again. Richard Brennan would spend the rest of his life in a small cell, thinking about the choices that had brought him there. Amy's hearing had been 2 weeks earlier. Her cooperation with prosecutors had earned her a plea deal: 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, with the possibility of parole in 3. She'd testified against Richard with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding that her elaborate plan had been orchestrated by someone far more ruthless than she'd ever imagined. Derek had attended her sentencing but hadn't spoken to her. What was there to say? Amy Morrison had betrayed everything they'd built together for money that was never real in a relationship that had been a lie from the beginning. She would serve her time and eventually be released to rebuild her life somewhere else. Derek wished her no harm, but he also wished her no contact with his world ever again. Lisa had received immunity in exchange for her cooperation, but she'd still paid a price for her betrayal. Her reputation in their small town was destroyed, and she'd moved to another state to start over. Before leaving, she'd asked Tyler to give Derek a message. She was sorry for everything she'd done and hoped he could someday forgive her. Derek's response had been simple. Forgiveness was for people who made mistakes, not for people who made deliberate choices to hurt others. Lisa had chosen to help destroy his life for money. The fact that she'd eventually chosen to save herself didn't erase that betrayal. The financial aftermath had been complex, but ultimately favorable for Derek. The court had ordered full restitution from Brennan Development's assets, which included millions of dollars in properties and investments. Derek's losses had been minimal since he'd transferred his assets before the scheme could be completed, and he'd actually profited from the legal settlement. More importantly, the FBI investigation had revealed that several other development companies had been using similar tactics to acquire properties across the region. Derek's case had become the centerpiece of a federal task force that was now prosecuting real estate fraud nationwide. Agent Vasquez had told Derek he should consider a career in law enforcement, given his natural ability to think like a criminal. Derek had declined politely. He had no interest in hunting criminals for the government when he was perfectly capable of handling his own problems. Now, 6 months later, Derek was rebuilding his life according to his own specifications. The house had been completely renovated, erasing every trace of Amy's presence. New furniture, new paint, new everything. Tyler had moved into the guest house on the property, and together they'd expanded the business to include a specialized division that provided security consulting for other small business owners. Derek had learned something important during the investigation. He wasn't the only successful person who'd been targeted by sophisticated con artists. There was a market for his particular skills in identifying and neutralizing threats to people who'd built something worth stealing. His first client had been a rancher in Montana whose wife had suddenly left him for a real estate developer who wanted to buy his land for a fraction of its value. Derek had exposed the scheme within 2 weeks and helped recover damages that bankrupted the would-be thieves. His second client had been a tech entrepreneur whose business partner had been secretly meeting with competitors to arrange a hostile takeover. Derek's investigation had revealed industrial espionage that resulted in federal charges and a settlement that made his client wealthy enough to retire. Word spread quietly through networks of successful people who understood that wealth and success made them targets for increasingly sophisticated criminals. Derek Morrison became known as someone who could see through elaborate deceptions and neutralize threats that traditional law enforcement was too slow or too limited to handle. The work suited Derek perfectly. He was protecting people who'd built something valuable from those who would steal it rather than earn it themselves. He was using skills he'd developed over a lifetime of dealing with betrayal and violence. And he was making enough money to live exactly the life he wanted without depending on anyone else. Derek's new house had been designed with security as the primary consideration. Bulletproof windows, reinforced doors, surveillance systems that could track movement for miles in any direction. The workshop behind the house had been expanded into a facility that could handle everything from basic repairs to advanced electronics and weapons maintenance. Tyler managed the day-to-day operations of the auto repair business, while Derek focused on consulting work. They'd hired 3 new mechanics and 2 office staff, all of whom had been thoroughly vetted and all of whom understood that loyalty to the Morrison family was the most important qualification for employment. Derek had no interest in remarrying. He'd learned that trusting someone with access to his life was the most dangerous thing he could do. He had relationships when he wanted them, but they were carefully controlled and never allowed to develop into anything that could threaten his security. The old Derek Morrison had been a man who believed in love, trust, and building a life with someone who shared his values. That man had been naive enough to be betrayed by the people closest to him. The new Derek Morrison was harder, smarter, and completely self-sufficient. Some people might have considered his new life lonely or paranoid. Derek considered it realistic. The world was full of people who would take everything from you if given the opportunity. The key was never giving them that opportunity. Derek's phone buzzed with a text message from a potential client in Texas, an oil executive whose son-in-law was pressuring him to change his will while his daughter was suddenly pushing for him to retire early. Another family scheme designed to steal a fortune from someone who'd worked his entire life to build it. Derek smiled as he typed his response. He'd learned to recognize the patterns of betrayal from a distance now, to see the early warning signs that someone was being set up for destruction. His job was to get there before the damage was done and make sure the would-be thieves understood the cost of targeting his clients. Derek Morrison had been tested by betrayal and had emerged stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than anyone who'd tried to destroy him. He'd built a new life based on the principle that loyalty was everything and betrayal was unforgivable. And anyone who thought they could take what belonged to Derek Morrison or his clients would learn the same lesson that Amy, Lisa, and Richard Brennan had learned. Derek Morrison never forgave, never forgot, and never lost a fight that truly mattered. Chapter 9, The Final Lesson. 2 years after the trials, Derek received a letter that surprised him. It was from Amy, postmarked from a federal correctional facility in Ohio. For a moment, he considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won over indifference. Derek, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. I've had 2 years to think about what I did, about the choices I made, and the people I hurt. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I know that's impossible. I'm writing because I need you to know that I finally understand who you really are. When I was planning to leave you, I thought I knew everything about Derek Morrison. I thought you were a simple man who would be devastated by my betrayal, who would either take me back or spend years trying to win me back. I thought you loved me too much to ever hurt me. I was wrong about everything. The Derek Morrison who exposed our scheme and destroyed Richard Brennan wasn't someone I'd ever met. You weren't devastated. You were calculating. You weren't heartbroken. You were strategic. You didn't love me too much to hurt me. You loved yourself too much to let me destroy you. I've talked to other women in here who tried to scam their husbands and lost everything. They all tell similar stories about underestimating the men they married. But none of them describe anything like what you did to us. None of their husbands had been planning for betrayal since before they got married. Lisa visits me sometimes. She told me about your new business, about how you help other people deal with the kind of situation we put you in. She said you're like a different person now, colder, more careful, completely closed off from emotional attachments. She said you destroyed us so completely that it sent a message to everyone in our world. Derek Morrison is not someone you can safely cross. I think that was always who you really were, Derek. I think the man I married was just a role you played until someone forced you to stop pretending. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand that some people are born to be victims, and others are born to make sure they never become victims. I understand that I confused kindness for weakness and love for vulnerability. Most of all, I understand that Derek Morrison was always the most dangerous man I'd ever met, and I was too arrogant to realize it until it was too late. I hope you're happy, Derek. I hope you found the peace that comes from never having to trust anyone again. Amy. Derek read the letter twice, then walked to his fireplace and burned it. Amy was right about most things, but wrong about the one that mattered most. Derek Morrison hadn't been pretending to be someone else during their marriage. He genuinely tried to be the kind of man who could love unconditionally and trust completely. Amy's betrayal had taught him that such a man was vulnerable to destruction by people who mistook decency for weakness. So Derek had stopped being that man and become someone who could never be betrayed again. The transformation had cost him the ability to love without reservation, but it had given him something more valuable, the certainty that no one would ever again have the power to destroy what he'd built. Derek's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Tyler's voice was urgent. Derek, we have a problem. That client in Colorado, the one whose daughter was trying to get him declared incompetent so she could take over his ranch, she just hired professional help. Derek walked to his office, where multiple computer screens displayed surveillance feeds from around his property and real-time information about his current cases. The Colorado client was a 70-year-old rancher whose daughter and son-in-law had been systematically isolating him from friends and family while building a case for guardianship that would give them control of his vast property holdings. What kind of professional help? Derek asked. The kind that specializes in making problems disappear permanently. I intercepted communications between the daughter and a man named Viktor Kozlov. He's got a reputation for making inconvenient people have fatal accidents. Derek studied the information on his screens. The rancher's case had seemed straightforward. A greedy family member trying to steal an inheritance through legal manipulation. But if they were willing to commit murder to get what they wanted, it meant Derek was dealing with people far more dangerous than typical con artists. Where's our client now? Safe house in Denver. I moved him there yesterday when we first detected the threat. But Derek, Kozlov doesn't just target primary victims. He eliminates anyone who might interfere with his employer's plans. Derek nodded. This wasn't the first time his work had attracted violent attention from people who preferred to solve problems with bullets rather than lawyers. It was one of the reasons he designed his property as a fortress and maintained relationships with people who could handle extreme threats. Bring our client here, Derek said, and call Marcus. Marcus Webb was a former Navy SEAL who ran a private security company that specialized in situations too dangerous for conventional law enforcement. Derek had worked with him twice before when clients faced life-threatening situations. Marcus didn't ask questions about legality or ethics. He simply eliminated threats to people under his protection. You think it'll come to that? Tyler asked. I think Viktor Kozlov is about to learn what happens when someone threatens Derek Morrison's clients. And I think a 70-year-old rancher is about to learn why people pay me so much money to protect what's theirs. Derek looked out at his property, where concealed security cameras and motion sensors monitored every approach. In the distance, he could see the reinforced buildings where he stored equipment for situations that required more than surveillance and legal maneuvering. Some people might have considered Derek's preparations excessive for a small-town business owner. But Derek had learned that the world was full of people who would use any level of violence necessary to take what they wanted. The only way to deter such people was to be more prepared for violence than they were. The rancher arrived that evening with Tyler, looking exactly like what he was, a tough old man who'd spent his life building something valuable and was now facing people who wanted to take it from him. Frank Garrison was Derek's kind of client, someone who'd earned what he had and refused to be victimized by those who hadn't. "Mr. Morrison," Frank said as Derek showed him around the secure portions of the property, "I appreciate your help, but I've been taking care of myself for 70 years. I don't need to hide from my own daughter." "Mr. Garrison," Derek replied, "your daughter just hired a professional killer to eliminate you and anyone helping you. This isn't about family dynamics anymore. This is about survival." Derek spent the evening briefing Frank on the security protocols that would keep him alive while Derek dealt with the immediate threat. Marcus arrived at midnight with a team of specialists who would handle the situation in ways that wouldn't appear in any police reports. "How do you want to handle this?" Marcus asked as they reviewed intelligence reports on Viktor Kozlov and his known associates. "Kozlov and his team will expect us to hunker down and wait for them to make the first move," Derek said. "Instead, we're going to find them first and make it clear that threatening my clients is a terminal mistake." Derek had learned long ago that the best defense was overwhelming offense. People who lived by violence understood only one thing: the certainty that attacking Derek Morrison's people would result in their own destruction. The next morning, Derek drove to the hotel where Kozlov's team was staying. But instead of confronting them directly, he did something that confused them. He introduced himself politely and invited them to lunch. "Mr. Kozlov," Derek said as they sat in a busy restaurant surrounded by innocent civilians, "I understand you've been hired to eliminate Frank Garrison and anyone protecting him." Kozlov was a compact man with dead eyes and hands that never stopped moving. He'd expected ambush or intimidation, not a civilized conversation over sandwiches. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kozlov said carefully. "Of course you do. But I want to give you the opportunity to reconsider your contract before things go too far." Derek pulled out a tablet and showed Kozlov detailed surveillance photos of his team, their weapons, and their planned approach routes. "As you can see, I've been watching you since you arrived. I know your capabilities, your intentions, and your escape plans." Kozlov studied the photos, his expression growing more concerned. Professional killers succeeded by being invisible and unpredictable. Derek had made him visible and anticipated his every move. "What do you want?" Kozlov asked. "I want you to understand what happens if you complete your contract. Frank Garrison is under my protection, which means killing him would be a direct attack on me. And people who attack Derek Morrison don't live to enjoy the profits." Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm not threatening you, Mr. Kozlov. I'm educating you. There are videos of this conversation being recorded from 6 different angles. There are detailed records of your presence here, your weapons, and your communications with your employers. If Frank Garrison is harmed, you and your entire team will be found dead within 48 hours, and the evidence will show that you died in a conflict with other criminals." Derek sat back and resumed eating his sandwich. "On the other hand, if you withdraw from this contract and leave Colorado immediately, you'll live to take other jobs from other clients. The choice is entirely yours." Kozlov was quiet for a long moment. Professional killers survived by accurately assessing risks and threats. Looking into Derek's eyes, he saw something that made his decision very easy. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our business in Colorado," Kozlov said carefully. "We'll be leaving today." "Excellent choice," Derek said. "Safe travels." By evening, Viktor Kozlov and his team had left Colorado without completing their contract. Frank Garrison's daughter found herself facing federal charges for conspiracy to commit murder, her elaborate inheritance scheme having collapsed into a criminal prosecution that would send her to prison for life. Frank himself returned to his ranch with a new understanding of why Derek Morrison charged such high fees for his services. Derek didn't just expose con artists and fraudsters. He dealt with any level of threat necessary to protect what his clients had built. That night, Derek sat on his porch looking out over his property. In the distance, he could see the lights of Tyler's house and the subtle glow of security systems that monitored every approach to their home. It was a life built on the principle that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford, but it was also a life where he controlled every variable that mattered. Derek Morrison had learned the hardest lesson life could teach. The people closest to you were often the most dangerous, and the only way to avoid being destroyed by betrayal was to become someone who could destroy the betrayers first. Some people might have considered such a life empty or paranoid. Derek considered it honest. The world was full of people who would take everything from you if they thought they could get away with it. Derek's job was making sure they understood they couldn't get away with it. And in a world where loyalty was rare and betrayal was profitable, Derek Morrison had built something more valuable than love or trust. He'd built the certainty that anyone who tried to destroy him would face consequences that would make them wish they'd never been born. Derek Morrison never forgave. Derek Morrison never forgot. And Derek Morrison never lost a war that truly mattered. That was the lesson Amy had learned too late, the lesson Richard Brennan had learned in a federal prison, and the lesson Viktor Kozlov had learned over lunch. Some men were born to be victims. Others were born to make sure they never became victims. Derek Morrison had spent his entire life becoming the latter. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.